Hello and welcome. My name's Rebecca and I'm the Scotland Programme Manager at EAUC, and I'll be hosting today's webinar on our new adaptation guide. We will have a short Q&A session after the presentations. So to give you a bit of background, which Ian will do a little bit more of in a minute, but in summer 2019, a working group from the sector, supported by EAUC, HEBCoN, the Higher Education Business Continuity Network, and AECOM, published two different guides to help institutions embed the risk of climate change within existing risk and business continuity procedures. So we'll be hearing from a few members of the working group today. So a quick introduction to our different speakers. We have Ian Patton first up, and he is EAUC's Chief Executive. We've got Kieran Power, who is AECOM's Practice Lead in Sustainability and Resilience. We have Mark Webster, who's representing HEBCoN, and also works for UWE as their Head of Business Resilience. And Andy Nolan, who is the Chair of OD's Sustainability Advisory Group and the University of Nottingham's Development and Sustainability Director. So first off, I'll hand over to Ian, and I'll get up the information for you, Ian.
Thanks, Becca. Morning, everyone. Ian Patton here. So we've been aware at the EAUC for some time that adaptation, climate adaptation in particular, is an area where the sector is struggling with. The EMR, the States Management Report, if you're familiar with that, consistently shows that we're struggling. Plus, the more recent version of 14,001 requires a broader perspective on environmental management and risks. But also EAUC is all about aligning sustainability with the key business of the university, its teaching and its operations. And we recognized that climate risk, environmental risks, where there's a huge opportunity if there was a better way of integrating environmental risks. You've got all sorts of operational and planning, governance and budgeting benefits. But we're also starting to get stories around the world of flooded labs, overheated classrooms, examination halls having to be emptied, people through flooding not being able to get into or out of university, archive servers being flooded, or servers being spiked by increasing lightning storms. And the chance, well, it was a great opportunity of meeting with Mark Webster, who many of us will know as the Sustainability Environmental Lead at UE, now in his business resilience role, came to EAUC saying, look, I think there's a need here, there's an opportunity. And it was so serendipitous because recently I had then met AECOM at the Green Building Conference and suddenly heard their adaptation experience in Australia. And you'll hear from Kieran in a minute from there. So we recognized between us that there really was a low recognition of the risks to a university and our students and our staff from the environment, particularly climate change. But also there wasn't a clear mechanism of how you calculate those and get those into the core business risk planning and mitigation adaptation response. So that's where this work came in. So we pulled together a steering group of HEBCoN, EAUC, and AECOM, and brought in UMAL, the sector's core mutual insurer, who give us some controlled access to some of the insurance claims. So it was interesting seeing increase in environmental, particularly flooding related claims. And we built a multidisciplinary group. We put out a call to all of our members, between HEBCoN and EAUC, and we pulled together a working group of about 10, 12 people from all over the sector, further education and higher. So really grateful to them for getting us here, but particularly grateful to Rebecca for project managing this from Scotland. Scotland takes a real lead on climate related reporting and adaptation. So thank you, Becca. The resources that we're talking about today can all be found on the Sustainability Exchange. There are two guides and our speakers will take you through those. And I think on your screen, you should see the page. So if you just go onto the Sustainability Exchange, go to projects, and you'll pull down this adaptation project, which we're reporting on today. So I'll leave it there, Rebecca, but hugely grateful to all of the people involved in this. I think it's really interesting to help us all, be we in the risk community, business risk community, or environmental or sustainability communities, to start to step back and see the interlinkage. We need new relationships between each other to really ensure that we are ready for the changes and the challenges and the opportunities that climate change is bringing us. So I'll hand over back to Becca.
Perfect, thank you very much, Ian, for setting the scene there. So now I'll hand over to Kieran, and I'll just get your slides up as well,
Kieran. Thanks, Rebecca. I'll wait for them to show up. So the wonders of technology have spared you my face, thankfully. So you can just focus on the slides. My camera is not working. So thank you very much, Rebecca. Thank you, Ian. It's been a tremendous pleasure working on this project with the entire working group, and indeed, I don't think we would probably be here with such a great product without the collaboration between risk professionals, climate change professionals, business continuity professionals, and just generally people who are passionate about what they do and willing to go a bit above and beyond. So I'm going to step you through the first of the two guides. They're already available to you, but I just wanted to, I guess, bring your attention to some of the highlights and I guess what the function of the first guide, titled Adapting Universities and Colleges to a Changing Climate, Making the Case and Taking Action. Big deep breath there, a long title. And kind of what its function is, and then I'll hand over to Mark afterwards, who will take you through what's different about the second guide and the circumstances in which you might use that. So obviously we're hearing a lot about climate emergency at the moment. The left-hand image there is one of my favourites. I really love looking at the different banners at the youth climate strikes, and the top one is by far my favourite. Hot and single, like our planet. Yeah, it's really great to see this kind of youth upswell around the need to take more climate action, and indeed, you know, businesses and governments around the world are really engaging more in this language of a climate emergency. I personally think this is a helpful thing. However, what you'll note when you work through this guide is that we have, I guess, tried to avoid sort of alarmism and hyperbole, and what you find is a really practical set of resources here that, I guess, take a measured level tone about the challenge and about the action that universities and colleges can take. And then if you, as professionals in your own organisation, you want to imbue that, you know, in your own work with a bit more kind of this kind of rhetorical language around emergency, then by all means you can do that. But we've really tried, I guess, to stick to the facts with these guides, and I think you'll see that as we step through these. So next one, Rebecca. So really basic foundational stuff. I'm sorry to those of you on the call for whom this is quite. I don't mean to be patronising, but just to really draw the distinction between the purpose of this guide and maybe some other resources that you might have seen from the EAUC and others. Obviously, climate change mitigation is a key action that universities and colleges need to be engaging in. So we're talking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions in order to slow or stop global climate change. A couple of clicks, Rebecca. However, you will have seen possibly these sorts of diagrams before, talking about the different emissions pathways that we're, depending on the level of action taken by governments, private sector, etc. in the future, the trajectories that our emissions might take. So obviously we are unfortunately tracking towards the more extreme scenario up the top there, the RCP 8.5 scenario at the moment. But I guess the point I would make is that even if we really do get our act together as a global community in the coming decade and change our trajectory towards some of those lower emissions scenarios, there is about a 40-year time lag between when we emit and the effect of those on global climate and global temperatures. So even if we do accelerate those efforts, some climate change is locked in. And I guess, Rebecca, if you could click forward, that's precisely why this guide here is very much focusing more so on the interrelated challenge of climate change adaptation. So how can universities and colleges adjust to the impacts of climate change and reduce negative consequences, but also exploit opportunities? They are absolutely related. There is a feedback loop linking between the two, but this is very much a tool to help you work through the challenge of adaptation. Back up. So who is this tool for? First and foremost, it will be of most use, in my opinion anyway, to sustainability managers, business continuity managers, and those kind of working in estates. However, the secondary audience, there's a lot of secondary audiences to that. Those people in those positions I just mentioned really can use this as an influencing tool. So, you know, hopefully it has content for you that can help, I guess, do some level setting and make sure that those who use the guide are all speaking a similar language around key climate adaptation principles. And they can do that. And once they have that, there's a bunch of tools here that I guess can help you to more effectively influence decision makers within your organization to try and garner the support that's going to be required to actually take some increased action around climate adaptation. And what you see on the right of your screen here is, I guess, a core aspect of this guide that's at the start that's really used to help you do this level setting in terms of understanding your organization's existing level of maturity in terms of climate adaptation. So there are some prompting questions there that encourage you to consider about your own organization, and the outcomes of those questions will determine maybe where is the most appropriate point in this guide for you to dip into. So are you at the stage where you still need to establish a case for action? Are you at a stage where the consensus already exists in your organization, but you need to do more to actually just understand what the risks and opportunities are? Or are you quite advanced and you're really at the point where you want to execute additional strategies to become more resilient to climate change? And so hopefully this tool will be relevant to organizations at all of these levels of maturity. Rebecca. So just I guess taking you through very quickly a few of the resources that might be of help. At that stage of establishing the case for action, we have something called the elevator pitch, which is really designed to be just that, a concise summary, a pitch, an articulation of the challenge and the opportunity presented by climate change that may be of use to you when trying to get this message across to those in positions of influence at your organization. You might find that there are aspects of this that work for you, there are aspects that don't. We're not suggesting in any way this is a prescriptive script that ought to be read, but rather something that if it sparks some thoughts for you on messaging, then we'd love to see you using it. Click. Additionally, some other resources in here. I guess there's a really nice, concise summary around climate change projections, which can help you again in making this case to others in your organization. Give them a sense for some of the different changes that your university or college might need to be prepared for in terms of the climate. Next. And then, as well as that, we have quite concise summaries of the different key risks and opportunities to the sector, which again can add a bit of depth and a bit of colour to this elevator pitch, thinking about the different aspects of university operations, of college operations that interact with our climate and that could be that risks to them could be exacerbated by climate change. Next. So at the stage of identifying risks and opportunities, there is what we feel is quite a useful matrix or list of the different sorts of skills and institutional knowledges and competencies that you will need to have at your disposal if you want to tackle the issue of climate change. So it's very much worth reviewing those to make sure that in terms of the team that you might choose to assemble to tackle this issue, that those different skills and knowledge sets are at your disposal. Back up. And then the guide also has some references through kind of a consolidated list of different existing tools that there are that may assist you with going through a process of climate change adaptation planning. So we do have the guide that Mark will speak to you about shortly that really tries to provide a somewhat bespoke tool for the sector. However, we very much acknowledge that there's already a lot of great stuff out there, and we don't want to reinvent the wheel. So I would really recommend that you do explore some of these tools and understand the value that might be, the value of these existing resources as well. Next. And finally, we get to the stage there of actually executing adaptation strategies. So the document that I am referring to now touches on at a very high level our process that Mark will go through shortly in terms of what we call a business impact assessment for universities and colleges. And you'll see there this 7-step process that we've articulated. Rebecca? The guide also includes some different summaries of what we actually mean by climate adaptation approaches. So thinking about different ways to reduce our exposure, so the extent to which we are actually come into contact with different sorts of climate hazards and their impacts, reducing sensitivity, so to what extent we are harmed by the impacts, by the hazards if we're exposed, and then also thinking about different sorts of mechanisms for improving organisations' adaptive capacity, so how they can actually, should they find themselves exposed to a hazard, what are the ways of changing and modifying operations so that we can continue to be agile going forward. So this guide summarises these at quite a high level. Rebecca, if you go forward now, basically I will hand over to Mark now, because what you'll hear about next is our guide around using an existing organisational framework to actually do this. So to produce a climate change adaptation plan for your institution. So Mark will take you through now more specifics on the how. And I'm more than happy to answer questions about Guide 1 at the end of the call.
Excellent, thank you very much. That was great, Kieran. So I'll hand over now to Mark. Do you want to share your screen, Mark?
Right, morning everyone, and thank you, Kieran. So I'm going to take you through the second document that we developed, which tries to bring together the risk management and business continuity frameworks that you may all have in your institutions to demonstrate how those existing frameworks can be used to develop a climate change adaptation plan within your organisation. So the principles behind risk management really is to help develop a targeted, prioritised and proportionate approach to risk management. So these tools take you through a structured process to help you answer the questions: how will it actually affect us from a risk perspective, and therefore how do we actually need to adapt? So by making use of existing processes and existing governance systems, if you've used a recognised tool a tool that the institution is already familiar with seeing to calculate the disruption that threats can cause to critical functions of the organisation and what risk that actually represents to strategic objectives, you draw on the benefit of it already being a recognised process. So when something is then presented through that process as a risk, this is a risk. So it gets you onto a strong footing rather than being something they're not quite so familiar with. Okay, so I found when I started in my risk journey that not everyone absolutely understood what a risk was. So it's just to clarify at the beginning. So a risk is an uncertain event. It's something that might happen. So our poor old mouse there might come to a sticky end. His helmet's not actually that good actually on there because that's not where he'd get hit. But anyway, so it's an uncertain event, and a business risk is a risk that may affect the achievement of objectives. So whilst climate change is undoubtedly happening, there's not a risk as to whether it's going to happen or not. It is going to happen. The extent to which it's going to affect us is the uncertain thing. So that's what we can use our risk frameworks and business continuity frameworks to help us understand. As I said before, if we were able to demonstrate through these processes that this genuinely presents a significant risk to the organisation, that will sway decision making. So the process that I'm going to talk you through is as shown on here. So how to build a team, or who should be part of the team, how you start to prioritise by confirming at the beginning what strategic priorities are in the first place, what the risks are to those priorities, what the organisation's tolerance to those risks is, and based on the level of risk, what sort of strategic approach should you take to tackling climate change, and therefore you then produce this risk-based plan that is more likely to be implemented. So your team, so you're basically going through this process, you're going to run some workshops, and you need appropriate knowledge and experience around the table. Ideally, you'll have a senior management sponsor. They may well not sit around the table, but knowing that you've got support from the top straight away, that this is something that's going to make a difference to decision making, helps engage people in the process. You'll then need someone who's going to manage the project. There inevitably, it might actually be a program of work rather than a project. So there might be several individual projects looking at different business areas. So you want your sustainability lead, a risk lead, and a business continuity lead if you have both of those. I do both of those at UE, but you might have separate ones within your institution. You may need a climate change expert. At UE, we've used academics on this, so the climate change expert brings that expert knowledge of what climate change is and what the expectation is of how the climate is going to change over time. Even though my previous job was sustainability at UE, until I started undertaking this project, my knowledge of actually what climate change is and the various hazards that it presents wasn't as strong as it is now. So it could be a climate change expert rather than just a sustainability expert. Might be really useful there. And then depending on which area you're looking at to determine what the business disruption will be, you'll want a subject matter expert or a departmental lead, someone who knows. If you're looking at estates, you need someone from estates in those particular workshops. Okay, so that's your team. So then once you've got your team, you start by doing, so these are some technical terms now. I've chosen to stick with them for consistency. People who are here from business continuity will recognise some of these terms. So you start with something called an initial business impact analysis. This can be complicated or relatively straightforward. I think the straightforward approach is best to adopt, and this makes quite a difference to the whole way your project will run. So it basically is some work by your project team initially to try and identify where impacts are likely to hit. So there's no detailed analysis at all, but it's to present to your senior team the potential likely effects of climate change on the organisation and what critical functions are likely to be impacted by it. So that the director, well, we call it the director at UE, your most senior team then is making a decision on what they see as the critical functions of the organisation that are key to the strategic success of the organisation that they do not want to see impacted by climate change. So it helps to prioritise what you're going to look at. If you're going to look at the whole organisation, it's a massive piece of work, but they will draw out certain things that they're particularly concerned about. And that's likely to be anything that could affect student recruitment, teaching, the learning experience, your ability to complete your research, and crucially, obviously, the impact on estate and infrastructure. So they will identify what those critical functions are, which starts to scope your work. So you've engaged your senior team right at the beginning, and you've scoped what the focus should be on. So that they're happy that it's going to be an industry word. I always hear here, don't create an industry out of this, create something that's quite focused. So then you get into the detail. So you've got the steer from your senior team as to what you should be looking at. For each of those, then you do something called a product and service BIA, so business impact analysis. So you're looking at each of those critical functions to determine the likely impact of climate change over time to those functions. And the over time function is quite important within this. So it is from two perspectives. So the first perspective is climate change is going to get worse over time. There's the various projections for the next 10, 20, 30 years, etc. But also the over time is to try and determine how long it would take for disruption to become intolerable to stakeholders or the delivery of those critical functions. So so as an example, as the temperatures are going to get warmer over summer, how far ahead is it until that's going to become quite unbearable? And also, when it is getting warmer, how tolerable are our people going to be of those increased temperatures? So the summers that we've had recently have been uncomfortable, but probably not unbearable. We've had quite a lot of tolerance to those. But if it had gone on for many more weeks, maybe that would be intolerable. And maybe within the next 20 years, that's when that's going to start to hit. So you're trying to break down the impact of and the detail of what the actual impact of the various climate change hazards are on those critical functions of the organisation. So you could almost imagine a matrix. So take the estates function as an example. Let's try a sec. Taking the estates function as an example, you could break estates down into maybe office space, teaching space, accommodation, your specialist space, maybe even your plant rooms, or you could do it on a building by building basis. And you could look at those and then assess against each of those how the different climate change hazards. So as I said, so it could be the extreme heat, extreme cold, rainfall, flooding, wind, etc. Also things like disruption to the supply chain, or the critical infrastructure disruption, changes in regulations, etc. How all those different elements of climate change, hazards of climate change, will impact on those different critical functions. So you will end up then with this business impact analysis will outline where there is likely to be significant disruption to your organisation. So once you've done that, and this is a slight deviation from business continuity approach, where we merge it into risk management, then you summarise from that what the risks are to the organisation. So using your existing corporate risk register and scoring methodology, you put into that risk, let's say it could be, say your accommodation is going to be unfit for purpose due to flooding or whatever reason. By this certain date, you put that into your risk register, the likelihood of it happening, the impact if it does, using that scoring methodology, and then that will then present that against all other corporate risks. You're putting it into the same framework, so it's not standing alone. There's no risk of this being seen as a sustainability risk. It's now a corporate risk. So all the different significant disruption that's been identified through the business impact assessment gets put into this risk register, and that is then presented. You're going back to your senior team now with this draft risk register to look at something called their risk appetite. There's much written on risk appetite. I've got a book which is 200 pages long called Short Guide to Risk Appetite, but fundamentally it's how much do we actually care about these different risks. So you're presenting your risk register to your senior management team to make decisions on what should be prioritised. So they will see what the different risks are, and they will determine whether that is something we need to take stronger mitigation on. And depending on the level of appetite they have to tolerate those risks will depend on the adaptation approach. So if your institution has a very low risk appetite, so they're not wanting to tolerate disruption at all to those critical functions, you're going to have stronger controls in place to probably completely reduce exposure to the risk, as opposed to something which you're more prepared to take a risk as to whether that's going to affect us. You could have contingency plans or business continuity plans in place to be ready to go should the disruption become more intolerable over time. So crucially, what this is doing is making sure that your response is proportionate to the level of risk. So this is kind of you're deciding the approach. You're not writing your plan at this point. You're deciding what your approach should be. that's when you start to write plans. So you've gone through a process with your senior team and with your workshop members to determine what the business impact of climate change is going to be, what the risks are to the organisation from climate change, and what senior management team's tolerance is to those risks, so that you're now having this targeted, prioritised and proportionate response to those risks, and they're listed here, or they're different types of mitigation approaches that you could put in place. So further investigation might involve, it's just that we don't know enough about this. We need to do more investigation or keep an eye on the data as time goes on. Policies and procedures could be things like working from home more, or changing the hours of the teaching day. And your technical solutions are more where you're going to have to start making some changes to your building. So these all have different levels of cost, different levels of change that's required for the organisation, but you have the appropriate response to what the level of risk is for your organisation. So that is a very quick run through of what is in the second guide. There's a lot more information in the guide, and you can take your time reading through it, and it makes a lot more sense when you read through the guide. But yeah, happy to take any questions now from anyone.
I'm going to pass over now to Andy Nolan, who's going to give us a little bit of perspective from the odd side of things from his background.
So I'm here representing AUD, the Association of University Directors of Estates, and I've recently taken on the role as chair of the Sustainability Advisory Group. AUD's if you just click on Becca, please. We're an association with around 200 HE member organisations, and so I think it's fair to say that there's an opportunity here to influence and help and support directors of estates in understanding what the challenge of climate adaptation might mean for them. If you just click on again, Becca, I think the association really, unlike, echoing comments from Kieran and Mark, a lot of the focus is currently around carbon reduction, greenhouse gas emission reduction. And I think there is, without doubt, recognition that sustainability is now far more high profile within universities and certainly within estates directors' agendas. But I think it's fair to say that climate change and adaptation is still relatively low on the sort of risk, the priority list, but mainly I think because of our broadly our lack of understanding. So if you just click on Becca, I've just done a survey of AUD members with Jane White at AUD's office, and what we are seeing is a recognition that adaptation is going to become more of an issue in the future, but I think that initial focus is largely around climate targets, carbon reduction targets. But I think I'll take somewhat optimistic sort of views on that, the understanding of adaptation is there, and we're already dealing with the consequences of adaptation and the need to adapt in our day-to-day estate operations. I'm pretty sure that most of you that are on the call here, perhaps with the exception of Kieran, are experiencing incredibly heavy rainfall outside right now. And if you get back to the office, you'll find that there will be floods, water ingress and damaged property somewhere on your estate by about lunchtime. And I think it's understanding that and contextualizing it. You're no longer able to deal with this as a kind of business as usual matter. My take on this is that climate change is going to magnify the stresses and the pressures that are already on our estate. And the estate in the university estate in the UK is growing. It's never been bigger. In the last EMR return, and the report from AUD came out, I think, last week. In the last reporting year, which was 17-18, there was £3.5 billion of capital investment spent on UK higher education estates in that one financial year. The question and the challenge I would put back to all of us is, to what extent was climate adaptation built into that investment plan? How well designed have those buildings been, and have they taken into account future climate change? A lot of that growth is in large research institutions. About 50,000 square metres of the growth in the gross internal area of our estate has been in those large research areas where inevitably power systems, environmental controls and building operations are more fragile and more easily affected by external climate factors outside, which are likely to have an impact on business continuity. I think the other point to make is that student numbers are rising quickly, and the density and use of our buildings is only going to become greater, and therefore the estate is going to be asked to work harder for longer, both on a daily, weekly and throughout its lifetime, and the climate change impacts are likely to put additional stresses on that estate. So if we've got problems now, I think the climate change challenge is that it's going to magnify those impacts quite significantly. Okay, Becca, if you can just click on again. So for me, there are probably 5 big reasons why it's important to protect our physical assets and to do that now. First and foremost, all of us value our estate and the assets that we have. Climate change and damage caused by changing climate, extreme weather patterns, etc., will mean that the value of our estate will be compromised. It could reduce, and without doubt, insurance premiums will increase as a result. So it's absolutely crucial that you understand and we understand how we're going to maintain the value of our estate and the quality of our estates. Without doubt, business continuity has already been flagged up, so I'm not going to say too much about that, but certainly the expectations now are that if there is an interruption to business, you know, where there's blame, there's a claim, and I'm pretty certain that loss of business, whether it's from students or from conferencing activity or other kind of commercial activity, will almost certainly translate that risk into a financial cost to the university. Without addressing the whole climate adaptation agenda, it's going to be very difficult for us to develop our estates any further. And a lot of that is through planning permission and planning control through local authority approvals. But, you know, flood risk is the obvious one, but there will be other factors that will, I'm sure, come in time. And I think the point that Mark made around the tolerance, that what is acceptable and tolerable, pretty much is a very subjective thing. You can start and stop processes, but user satisfaction, well-being is likely to be reflected in our NSS scores, in REF and even in TEF. So I think we've got to be very smart in how we put a financial value to some of the impacts that climate adaptation might put on us. And I guess the sort of final point I would say is that actually it's more cost effective to make those changes now. If you wait until the problems arise, the reactive nature of putting right things that weren't in place, whether that's a fairly soft plan around how you deploy your staff, or whether it's a hard plan around how you protect your physical assets, it's almost certainly better to do it in a planned way than a reactive way. Okay, thanks, Becca. Without sort of stressing it too much, I think from an estate perspective, there are probably 5 key areas that we would identify as high priority in terms of and these for me are the things that everybody just takes for granted. And you know, you expect your academic colleagues, your professional services colleagues will just assume that these things are going to work, and that's their minimum expectation. But impacts on energy supply, water supply, transport infrastructure, the buildings themselves and the building infrastructure within them, all of which are affected, and of course data networks. So anything that's got an exposure to overheating or flood in particular is likely to be vulnerable. My take on this really is that these systems have largely been designed for average, damp, sort of maritime conditions, and we're now putting extremes into the climate that these infrastructure systems simply weren't designed for. These are the basic things that everyone expects to work on a day-to-day basis, and largely have been underinvested in across the universities in the UK. Okay, Becca. So I really just wanted to echo and support the approach that's been outlined by Kieran and Mark and EAUC more generally, that this isn't about reinventing a new approach to how you manage climate change and the risks associated with climate change. It's important that we engage with our business continuity managers and that this does get that senior level buy-in. Don't try and create a new approach to it. And I really value the great work that Mark and Kieran have shared with us this morning. I think helping people understand the risk and the likelihood of the impacts that are associated with climate change is probably that first challenge. How do you convince your senior management team that those risks are real? And I would suggest that there are ways in which you can demonstrate the impacts you've already faced on your campus. My work at Sheffield City Council probably 10 years ago, we put together a local climate impact profile, which essentially took recorded evidence of climate impacts and demonstrated the impact that had on people, and we found that to be incredibly powerful. It's not, money's great and it does appeal to finance officers, but actually if you can show the impact on people, you can get a much stronger institutional buy-in. Okay, thanks, Becca. I guess one sort of plug on behalf of EAUC and ORD is the Sustainability Leadership Scorecard, which you'll see has adaptation as a key component of that. And it's not deliberate, but you'll notice, I think, that within that, just in that graphic there, adaptation, just graphically, is the poor relation in all of this. And I think if we can do one thing after today, it will be to try and raise the profile of climate change and our need to adapt much more prominently in our discussions and use the tool. So I love this picture. It was a picture taken on our campus, and the fact of an emergency exit going straight into a puddle it really did appeal to me. But I guess one of the things that I'm going to do as the chair of the ORD Sustainability Advisory Group is ensure that this guidance is well recognised and understood, and start to develop ways in which our estates managers can build their confidence and understanding of the issue. And I really like the approach that Mark was outlining in terms of understanding a really logical way of engaging a wide group of stakeholders. Okay, thanks, Becca. That's all from me. Happy to take questions.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much to our three key speakers. That's been really interesting. If you have got any questions for any of the speakers, not many of you have got cameras on, so I suggest the easy thing to do would be to comment in the chat box. Maybe just while we're waiting for some questions, Mark, you could talk a little bit about how you've put some of this into play within your own institution.
Yeah, so we've started the business continuity and risk management frameworks are well established within the university. But what isn't well established is developing the climate change adaptation plan. That's at the very early stages. So what we focused on at the moment is workshops with the estates function. That's probably the easiest to get your head around where the impact of climate change will be, but it's only one of the sort of critical areas of the institution. They take time. So whilst we don't want to make an industry out of it, trying to get a detailed enough understanding to inform the development of a strategy for how you're going to tackle climate change adaptation, it does need knowledgeable people about how stuff works and how the estates manager, the fabric of the buildings could be effective. How things were designed. So what were things designed for 1 in a 100-year flood, and what year is that based on, and is that now, how relevant is that now? So the actual vulnerabilities of your estate, it needs expert people who know what they're talking about to be round the table. And the initial workshop that we put in place was for 2 hours, and it nowhere near was completed. So this is where it's a program of work and requires a reasonable level of engagement from people. Okay.
That's great, thank you. So does anybody have any questions, or do you want to share your own perspective of how things are going in your own institution? So just have to think about that. We have one question that's come in. So at the start, how do you convince your risk colleagues that this is relevant, that climate change is relevant? Mark, do you want to take that one?
I would have liked to have thought that if someone, so certainly here, if someone comes to me saying we think we've identified a corporate risk and we'd like your help to structure how we explore this risk, I would like to think that they will certainly give you some time initially to have a conversation about how they could help, and they ought to, so if you can convince them of that this is a threat, give them the information about what climate change is, and a lot of the data like Kieran was summarising from that first document, and perhaps that you are prepared to be the project manager. So we don't want to just one risk with saying this, you can use the existing frameworks, is that this does not find its way as being owned and led by the risk or business continuity managers. It's part of a group. Yeah, just do some work beforehand to be able to demonstrate the level of threat or opportunities. Stuff I didn't touch on in mine as well. That climate change obviously presents opportunities, so you can use the risk framework to look at it the alternative way. Yeah, I would be astonished if your risk team would not want to be part of this process.
And do any of the speakers think that the project picked up any good examples of surprising climate risk problems in an institution? So things that you maybe hadn't thought about before?
Rebecca, I mean, so maybe not so much this project, but work more broadly with the sector. I would say there are some, quirky things that crop up from time to time. One of the ones that I've seen on more than one occasion that I wouldn't have thought about until we went and did the work with this institution was around having incredibly valuable and important archive material stored in basements. So it sort of sounds quite intuitive that a basement's a pretty good place to put your rare manuscripts, but out of sight, out of mind, all of that. However, in actuality, in this institution's particular case, it couldn't have been a worse place. It was one of the most flood-prone buildings on their estate, and so it happened. They had to deal with after an event with some serious damage to some pretty important documents. Also, that same institution has some servers stored in flood-prone areas. So yeah, I guess just thinking, it's amazing the amount of times that we've found that, in fact, some really important, valuable assets are in fact in some of the most vulnerable places on an estate, simply because it's not necessarily being thought through in a structured or methodological way.
Becca, in a similar way, when looking at the UMAL experience, our insurance experience, the increased intensity and number of lightning strikes had passed me by. We instantly think of flooding, we instantly think of temperature overheated spaces, but actually the intensity of lightning strikes, particularly knocking out servers or various electrical kit, for me was very under-recognized. So Yeah, and obviously, you know, the UK is a little bit sheltered at this stage, but if you go, you know, Kieran has he's actually in Australia right now where he lives. He's got some real insight into universities at the sharper end of the changing climate, and you go to Africa and they're experiencing amazing things. But so we do have a heads up here, but I do think under recognizing things like lightning is a real risk to us.
If I can add as well that using the business impact analysis methodology, where you don't start by diving in and trying to work out what the business impact is, you're trying to work out what could be impacted on, and break down these functions into where you then might find things surprisingly. So focusing on the estate and infrastructure is an important area, but if you have a critical function actually is learning and teaching, and then you break that down into what actually is it that delivers learning and teaching, that brings into it your global taught activities, the field work trips that you'll be doing, the research projects that are around the world. And so it massively opens up. So what are all these things that we're doing? And some of those will be more critical than others. And actually it turns out that that one of the key partnerships you've got for field work in the part of the world is extremely more vulnerable now to flooding than the whole travel risk, for example. So linking it and then to other risks escalate. So it's that part that you do where you're not diving in and trying to work out what I might not have made this clear in the presentation. Actually, you're not diving in and trying to work out what the impacts are going to be. You're starting by trying to break your organisation down into what it actually does. And once you know in more detail what it actually does and the dependencies we have on those, you can then find how you can then link more easily how climate change might affect them.
Great, thank you very much to the three of you for that. So we have one more question that's come in from Jane from Odd. So can we utilise the student voice to levy change? So at the moment we're seeing a lot from the student voice in terms of carbon reduction targets, but do we think that the student voice can be used or is getting stronger around actually adapting to the changing climate?
Becca, I'll jump in on that one. That's a really good question, Jane. You know, I love hearing the news today that climate strike is it the Oxford English Word of the Year or whatever, and that's fantastic. Yes, we have to. And yeah, you mentioned the strikes and about, you know, the student push to net zero greenhouse emissions, but prior to that and continuing, we have divestment. So I think this could be another dimension of that, because your students expect they're paying through the nose, and there's a duty of care to them. So I think with a little bit of engagement and understanding, I do think the students can be brought into this or be encouraged in this space or allowed in to have a voice, because you know they're expecting a service and they're expecting quality, and they're you know they've paid for it. So I do think we've got to encourage the student voice in this space, and EAUC with others is launching a climate commission, and there's a lot of students in that space alongside vice chancellors or principals. So I think definitely Jane, you're prompting me to ensure that we look at the climate change risks and adaptation and the student voice in that space as part of the mix.
Great, thank you very much, Ian. So I think I better draw everything to a close. Mark, do you have something quickly to say?
Let's say the student voice, you might already have some student voice. So when you're doing your workshops to try and identify what the business impact of climate change could be, one of the ways to kick off those is rather than look at the future, look at the past. How's it already affected us, and where would you get that evidence from? And if it is already starting to affect students, you might have already collected that, maybe some comments on the NSS survey or the other stuff where you've already talked to your students. There might already be some information there. So yeah, that could be used.
Great, thank you very much. If you have any other questions following this webinar, please don't hesitate to get in touch. The best way is to contact info@eauc.org.uk, and it'll be forwarded to the most appropriate person. We hope that some of you will be joining us at the Scotland Conference in Glasgow, and also the Green Gown Awards in Glasgow, which are on the 26th of November. And we're really looking forward to hosting both of those in Glasgow, Scotland, coming really soon. So thank you very much to our speakers. Thank you to you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time.